You know that feeling when you're surrounded by people, your phone is full of notifications, you have hundreds of online friends, and yet somehow you still feel completely alone? Not lonely in the dramatic, crying at night way, just this quiet, persistent sense that no one really knows you. That if you disappeared tomorrow, the world would keep spinning exactly the same. Most people look at your generation and see connection everywhere. They see group chats, Discord servers, Instagram stories. They see you constantly online, always available, perpetually engaged. And so they assume you're fine, that you have more ways to connect than any generation in history, so how could you possibly be lonely? But here's what they're missing. Gen Z isn't lonely despite having more connection tools. Gen Z is lonely because of how those tools fundamentally changed what connection means. The loneliness epidemic in your generation isn't about a lack of social skills or too much screen time in the way older generations want to believe. It's about something far more specific. It's about growing up in a world where the infrastructure of human connection was designed to maximize engagement, not intimacy. And your nervous system knows the difference, even when you can't always articulate it. Let's talk about what happened developmentally. Most of Gen Z came of age during a very particular window. Smartphones became ubiquitous, social media shifted from optional to obligatory, and then the pandemic hit during your formative years. These weren't just inconveniences, they were neurological disruptions during the exact period when your brain was learning how to bond with other humans. Research on adolescent brain development shows that between ages 12 and 25, your brain is essentially rewiring itself around social connection. The prefrontal cortex is maturing. The limbic system is hypersensitive to peer feedback. You're biologically wired to seek belonging, to learn reciprocity, to practice vulnerability in relatively low-stakes environments. That's how humans have always learned to connect. But your generation learned to connect through screens, through curated profiles, through metrics that quantified your worth in real time. And here's the crucial part. Your brain adapted. It learned that connection means being seen, not being known. That friendship means staying in touch, not going deep. That vulnerability is a brand strategy, not a risk you take with someone who's earned your trust. And this wasn't a choice you made. It was the environment you inherited. And the cruelty of it is that you were taught to perform connections so well that even you can't always tell the difference between real intimacy and its simulation. You know how to be relatable, how to share just enough to seem open, how to maintain relationships through likes and reactions, and the occasional "we should catch up soon" that never actually happens. And it works, in a way. It keeps people around, it keeps you from being completely alone, but it doesn't make you feel less lonely. Because loneliness isn't actually about the number of people you interact with. It's about whether you feel safe enough to be yourself with them, whether they've seen the parts of you that don't perform well, whether the connection would survive if you stopped being entertaining or helpful or easy. And for many people in Gen Z, the answer is you don't know, because you've never tested it, because the infrastructure of your friendships was built on convenience and consistency, not depth. Because the algorithms that facilitated your connections were optimized for retention, not for the messy, inconvenient, sometimes boring work of actually knowing another person. There's something else happening here too. Gen Z grew up watching older generations publicly perform their lives online. You saw the curated vacations, the highlight reels, the aesthetic breakfast photos, and you learned, often unconsciously, that the version of yourself you show the world needs to be worth watching, that ordinariness is a kind of failure, that your life is only valid if it's documentable. This creates a strange paradox. On one hand, you're more aware than any previous generation of the performative nature of social media. You know it's fake. You critique it. You're conscious of the game. But on the other hand, you're still playing it, because opting out means disappearing, and disappearing feels like ceasing to exist. So you stay, you post, you engage, you maintain the performance, and the loneliness sits underneath it all, unacknowledged, because admitting you're lonely feels like admitting you failed at the one thing your generation is supposed to be good at, staying connected. But here's what almost no one says out loud. This loneliness isn't a personal failure. It's a design flaw in the environment you were raised in. You're not broken. The the system is. Different generations respond to different stressors. Boomers dealt with economic instability by valuing security. Gen X dealt with institutional distrust by valuing independence. Millennials dealt with precarity by valuing flexibility. And Gen Z is dealing with hyperconnection by valuing authenticity, even though you're not always sure what that looks like in practice. The fact that you feel lonely despite having hundreds of contacts isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're human, that your nervous system knows the difference between transaction and connection, between presence and proximity, between being seen and being known. And maybe the question isn't how to fix your loneliness by getting better at the tools you were given. Maybe the question is whether those tools were ever designed to meet the need in the first place. Because real connection, the kind that actually makes you feel less alone, requires time. It requires boredom. It requires showing up even when there's nothing interesting to say. It requires the patience to sit with someone while they figure out how to say the thing they're afraid to say. And none of that is optimized for an algorithm. You're not lonely because you're antisocial. You're lonely because you were raised in a world that monetized attention and called it community, and your body knows the difference. If this landed somewhere true for you, there's more to understand about how your generation learned to cope with a world that wasn't built for your developmental needs, and why recognizing that matters more than fixing it.